Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 10. Vows. David wondered how long it would be until Beth returned. It was hard not to go with her, but he knew this was something she had to do on her own. He could not help her. She did not want his help. Instead, he had been observing the night watchman walk around the town square. Twice, this person had missed David standing next to a large tree that stood in front of the houses on the west side of town, and David wondered how efficient a night watchman could possibly be if he was unable to spot the one type of intruder he needed to catch. As the watchman wandered around the square for the third time, David squinted his eyes to try to make out the person's face. On the first two passes, he had hidden behind the tree when the person had walked around to the point where he might see David. But this time, David decided he would attempt to identify this person. It only took a moment for recognition to dawn on him, and he quickly hid behind the tree again. He looked up and saw Beth was walking toward him, wiping her eyes. She looked tired, and clearly she had been crying. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly when she reached him. "Better," she said. "It was awkward. I didn't know what to say. I don't know if this helped or not." "I'm sure it did," he assured her. She stood only inches from him, and instinctively he held out his arm for her. She stepped into his embrace, and he held her close to him for the first time since he had to drop through the floor of the old mill with her. Holding her body against his, he felt complete for the first time in a long time. She sniffled again as she laid her head against his shoulder. He kissed her head and stroked her hair. He glanced around the tree to find that the watchman was walking right past them. He felt Beth draw in a breath of air to speak. "David," she began, but he put his hand over her mouth. Her stance changed as she went instantly alert. "What is it?" she whispered almost inaudibly. "One of my brothers," he whispered. "We need to get out of here. I don't know how it would affect him to see us." David glanced back to see if his brother Mark had passed by them, but instead Mark, who was now 31, had stopped and was craning his head around as if he had heard something. David watched him intently until Mark turned around fully to look directly at him. He froze for a moment like a wild animal suddenly caught by a predator, and then swiftly moved his head behind the tree again. His breath quickened, nervous. "We've got to get out of here," he whispered anxiously. "There's nowhere to go," Beth responded. Mark whipped around the tree, a primitive club raised in defense. "Who are you?" he asked sharply. David and Beth, two experienced Fempiror warriors, jumped away from him in surprise. Anyone observing the confrontation might believe that Mark had caught the two young lovers in an inappropriate situation. They stared at Mark, unaware of how to respond to him. After all, they no longer belonged in Hogginstown. They meant him no harm, and obviously he knew who they were, though he would not believe it. Mark looked at them for a very long moment, and then he relaxed, as if nothing was wrong. "Oh," he said. "David? Beth? You scared me. What are you doing out so late? You know the rules. Go on home." David was somewhat relieved. Mark did recognize them, but in Mark's typical fashion, he completely forgot where he was, and apparently also forgot that David and Beth had both been missing for 10 years. He responded the only way to respond in such a situation. "Yes," David said quickly. "Pardon us." "Pardon," Beth said as well. They walked quickly past him and moved faster than Mark would have believed possible out of town. Mark watched the pair slide past him. He felt they should really know better than to be out after hours. After all, people disappear at night. Well, it had not happened for a long time, but the mayor himself had put him in charge of the night watch all the same. He was proud to serve. He walked on his prescribed path, making sure the town remained safe from the evil that had come into their lives 10 years ago and taken his brother away. Of all people, David should know to stay in at night, since he was the first one to... "David?" Mark whipped around to see two figures disappear into the darkness. Had he seen them? Would anyone believe him? Should he tell someone? Or perhaps in the future he should not allow Mr. Witt to serve him one last drink before he closes up for the night. David and Beth walked briskly away from Mark and never looked back. They reached the road leading out of town to the south, and once they passed the shops on the south side, they ran to ensure they would disappear into the darkness before Mark had a chance to follow them or even see them again. The fact that he had spotted them was unfortunate, but they could not change what happened. He knew that Mark could not have followed them, but he worried about what this might do to Mark, who had always been slow. David was at least grateful only one person had seen them. They crossed the distance between the town and Zechariah's house in only a few minutes, and looked behind them. "I sure hope he thinks we're ghosts or a dream or something," David said. "I'm sure he'll be fine," Beth assured him. Somewhere between the town and here, Beth had regained some of her stoic Alewo demeanor. David nodded as she walked to the mound that held the levicart. David took a step to follow her, but he stopped and looked at the tunnel leading to the door to Zechariah's house. Beth glanced at him, and noticing he stopped, she turned to him. "What is it?" she asked. "I want to go inside for a moment," David told her, and walked to the door. "Are you looking for something?" Beth asked. "No," David said. "I just have to see it again." Beth nodded and followed him into the short tunnel, which was cut smooth the first time he had seen it. Now grass had grown in almost to the door. Dirt had collapsed from the sides and top of the tunnel, giving it a very rough look, but not wholly blocking the door yet. Rain and wind had blown in toward the door over the years, covering it in a layer of dirt, which had the added benefit of further obscuring the house. He worried what the elements might have done to the interior. David opened the door to the house and pressed the light button on the wall. The house remained dark, which David had assumed would happen. He had learned much about the churning pool systems over the years, and knew how simply they operated. All it took was a spark to get them going again, and most Fempiror had the spark button near the outermost entrance. He felt around the light button and found another button. This one was a little harder to press, and when pressed, it gave a loud snap. A hum sounded deep within the house, and he knew that since he had already pressed the light button for the main room, the lights would illuminate once the churning pool started turning. It took about 30 seconds before the lights flickered on throughout the large round room that served as both the living room and kitchen. Zechariah had done an exceptional job on its construction, as the wood-covered walls, floor, and ceiling showed very little wear from 10 years of total neglect. Some water had stained the corners of the room where the wood came together, but the damage was negligible. To his right was an open door, which held the bed that David had awakened in after his transmutation 10 years ago. Ahead of him were two more doors, one of which housed the churning pool he had just activated, and to his left was a hall leading past the kitchen area. David had always assumed the other closed door off the main room was Zechariah's room, but he knew nothing about the rest of the house. The opening of the door had stirred a layer of dust off the floor, which swirled in front of them. Dust and cobwebs covered everything in the house, since no one had been here since he and Zechariah left for Aram. David walked slowly inside as Beth closed the door behind them. David gazed around the room and vividly remembered his first few days again. Zechariah had made the Rostim code proud by saving David's life when David wanted to leave in the middle of the day. David glanced at his hand, which had completely healed of the burn Zechariah had given him to prevent him from leaving that morning. He hated Zechariah then, but he knew that if Zechariah had not done that, David would have tried to leave and died right then. The old man had saved his life repeatedly, and that unconditional love for a complete stranger led to his death. David was not sure even now that he could do the same if ever the situation arose. "This is where he lived?" Beth asked, walking up behind him and breaking him from his reflection. "For quite some time, as I understand it," David said with a nod. He turned to what was his room for a short time and pressed the light button. The lantern-shaped light on the little table to the left of the bed in the center of the room provided more than enough light for the little room. Beth followed him into the room and stood next to him. "This is where I woke up," David said, gesturing to the bed. Zechariah was as consoling as he could be, but I was just hideous to him. With everything I put him through, he still cared. He stood by me. "It was his job," Beth said simply. David nodded. "I know," he said, "but you know as well as I do that not everyone would have done what he did." Beth touched his shoulder gently before she left the room. David turned away from the bed and pressed the light button as he joined Beth back in the main living area. David walked to the room with the churning pool to see how it had survived all these years of neglect. He opened the door into a room that was built exactly like his bedroom, but in the center of the room was a near-perfect circular pool of water with what looked like lightning flashing under the surface. David pressed the light button in this room, and he could see as the single light on the ceiling illuminated the room the larger wires that led out of the pool and through the walls into the other parts of the house. The tube that led in from the outside wall to just over the surface of the pool that channeled the water from the outside into the pool was still in place. The pool was about 3 feet deep, but about halfway down were points of contact within the ring that went around the outer edge of the bottom of the pool. The flashes occurred at the points that these circling arms touched the outer ring. Like the Levicart, the churning pool fascinated him even still, since versions of this existed in everything the Fempiror had that used any kind of power. Zechariah had built this one so well that even after 10 years of disuse, it was still in excellent condition and worked perfectly. David had been afraid that the pool would have overflowed even with the drains at the top of the pool, but Zechariah knew what he was doing there too, and the edge of the pool was completely dry. Beth stepped into the room behind him and looked at the pool. "Did he build this himself?" she asked, awe coming through her voice. David nodded. "It's no wonder they thought he was so dangerous," he said. "Ulrich showed me the one in Eruftium and explained how it worked, but I could never understand it," Beth commented. "I've had it explained a few times, and I still don't really understand it," David said. "I've put more water in the levicoils over the years, of course, but I've never had one stop working. I'm not sure I could fix that. If this hadn't worked, we'd be in the dark for sure." "Will it work as long as we're here?" she asked. David nodded again. To be certain, Zechariah had been a master of many things. It was no wonder that Tiberius had said that the Fempiror world would experience no greater loss. Who else knew what this man knew? Together they left the room, and David pressed the light button to extinguish the light. Beth wandered across the living room toward the hall next to the kitchen. He followed her down the short, empty hall to a small room that only had a table with a plain Christian cross on it. Above the cross was a small hole with a window that allowed a view of the stars. David gathered that at certain times of the day, that window would permit the sun to shine directly on the cross. There was no light button in the room, so he guessed that the lighting here was intended to be natural. "I want to thank you for bringing me back," Beth said. David looked at her as she stared out the window. "I owed it to you," he said. "It's my fault you're like this." Beth shook her head. "We share the fault," she said, looking at the ground. "You didn't know, and I didn't care." "Do you regret it?" he asked. She shook her head again. "Not the act," she said. "I loved you. I thought I was never going to see you again." "Me too," he agreed. "But here we are," she said, and turned her eyes to his, together again. David smiled. It was as if no time had passed, and they were hiding from their families once more. But this time, they were two independent people who had endured heartache and loss over the years, and could actually make a more reasonable decision for their lives. He hoped she meant what it sounded like she meant. Would they approve of a Rostem and a Lewo being together? He asked, to confirm what she suggested. Her smile said it all. "Do you want to?" she asked. "We're going to live a long time," he said. "Why do it alone?" She held out her hands, and he took them both in his. They stood before the small table. The cross rested between them like a priest overseeing a ceremony. Someday they would find a priest to perform the ceremony properly, but to declare their intentions before God and themselves would work well enough for the moment. After all, they had already been one with each other, and since they had never been with any other since, David figured that in the eyes of God, they were already together. "I promised once that I would stand beside you for all eternity," she said. "We have an eternity ahead of us," he said. "Would you take that vow again?" "Would you promise to love me beyond all other promises and all reason?" she asked. "Beyond the vow of the Rostem and the vow of the Alewo, forsaking all others, cleaving one to another. What was formerly two will now be made one, from now until forever, Till death do we part. Till death do we part, David finished. He took her in his arms. Their faces were inches apart as they stared into each other's eyes. Me and you, right? He asked her, recalling those sacred words whose meaning only they understood. She smiled broadly, her eyes brimming with tears. For all eternity, she whispered. No matter what. Their lips pressed together in a moment that would stay with him forever.